Good morning, everyone. I hope that you have survived your first week of NTI with minimal problems. It's been pretty much a crazy week for me. I tried to do one of these screencasts, actually, two or three of them, like more than an hour's worth of work, and my school microphone did not record. So, really, fingers crossed that it's recording now. The entire week has just been insane, and I don't know how I feel about online school. I miss you guys, and I really wish you were here. And this is not at all how I envisioned the year going. So we will see. Hopefully, we get to come back. I don't know. Fingers crossed. Anyway, I guess I will go ahead and get started. So this is a PowerPoint about Vietnam. I really hope that everyone did the reading that I asked you to do, but just in case you did not, I'm going to go ahead and go through some things right now. So this is chapter 20, section 2. Sorry, let me switch the way this displays. Chapter 22, section 2. And basically, we are going to be talking about how the United States got involved in Vietnam and what led to us basically increasing or escalating our involvement. So we'll get right into it. Something to remember, the United States has been involved in Korea since 1954, and some people argue even earlier in the 1930s when we were helping the French. But President Johnson is the American president that officially increases U.S. involvement in a major way. And I'm just now seeing that I didn't capitalize the I in involvement, but I'm going to let that go. Ignore it. Remember, President Johnson becomes president in November of 1963 as a result of Kennedy being killed. And that event basically changed the course of the war. We don't know what Kennedy would have done had he finished his term and, potentially if he was reelected. But we do know for a fact that obviously President Johnson becomes president in November of 63, and this is the way things end up going. So in fall of 1964, President Johnson campaigns on the promise that he will, quote, not send American boys 9,000 or 10,000 miles away from home to do what Asian boys ought to be doing for themselves. In other words, in fall of 1964, President Johnson is at least telling the American people that he feels like the Vietnam War is more of a civil war and that American sons and daughters should not be going to fight someone else's war. As you and I know, that is not the way things end up happening. This quickly changes really in February of 65, but especially in March of 65. What happens? President Johnson changes his mind, changes his approach, and historically, we can look back and say, okay, was it all just dirty tricks? He wanted to be elected, so he was willing to say anything. Maybe that's the case, but it probably is a combination of sure, politicians will say whatever to get elected, but also a changing scenario in Vietnam. So in 1964, it was less obvious, but by 1965, spring of 1965, it was clear that South Vietnam was collapsing, the government of South Vietnam. And so they could not really wage the war on their own anymore. The actual leadership, remember that the president of South Vietnam was assassinated in 63, right before Kennedy. So then there's kind of a quick turnover. And then in 65, all the stuff starts to crumble. So in March of 65, President Johnson sends thousands of troops to Vietnam to contain the spread of communism. Remember, that is what the war is always about. We want to contain the spread of communism. That's our number one objective. By the end of 1965, there were more than 180,000 American troops in Vietnam. Remember, in 1963, again, Kennedy's alive, a different president, different scenario, only 16,000 in 1963. So obviously that's a substantial, significant increase in troops. Before we talk about the strategies behind the war, and that's really our goal today, that's what's going to drive the assignment I'm going to ask you to do tomorrow is going to be based on some of these strategies from today. But before we talk about the strategies, just some reminders or clarifications for you. The war is really between two sides, North Vietnam and South Vietnam. This is a similar scenario to North and South Korea. Remember, a lot of these countries were divided during the peace talks after World War II. So countries that had been controlled by Germany, countries that had been controlled by Japan, are administered by countries that won World War II. And a lot of the countries get divided between the United States and the Soviet Union. So this is a pattern that we see kind of repeat. But we have North and South Vietnam, with North Vietnam being communist, South Vietnam being democratic, maybe is a stretch, but democratic or democratic-ish. So North Vietnam, the war is fought by two groups. The North Vietnamese Army, or the NVA, this is a government-sponsored army. So you could compare them to like the Union or the Confederate Army during the Civil War. You know, it's a time when nobody's quite in agreement about who the real government is and who the real leadership is, but we know that both the Confederate Army and the Union Army were considered like government armies. Same thing with the North Vietnamese Army, that it's considered like the army of the government. The Viet Cong, often known as the VC or the NLF, the VC more than anything, they're a little bit different because they are basically rebels. They are in South Vietnam and Cambodia, but they are fighting on behalf of North Vietnam. So they want to unite North and South Vietnam. And again, they're like rebels that are actually embedded within South Vietnam and Cambodia. And you'll hear them called Viet Cong, VC, or sometimes just Charlie. That goes back to the phonetic alphabet, I think it's called, that the military uses. So VC in that alphabet would be Victor Charlie. So then Victor was dropped and Charlie kind of taken on instead. The southern side, you've got the Army of the Republic of Vietnam, or ARVN, ARVN. This is a government-sponsored army based in South Vietnam. So again, this is the government that is like this is the military that is led by the government. And then of course you have the United States military. And again, we are also a government-sponsored army, but we are sponsored by our government rather than the Vietnamese government. Okay. So right from the beginning, the war in Vietnam is a different type of war. It is much more a guerrilla type of war than Americans are used to fighting. The Viet Cong, or the VC, had an unquestioned disadvantage in terms of sheer size and weaponry. Like, obviously, they're a rebellion, they're a small group, you know, they don't have anything even close to the technology that American armies would have and that the South Vietnamese have because of the American army. But they do have some major advantages that the United States was not expecting. So like I mentioned, they engaged in guerrilla warfare. And you have to think about the environment that these soldiers are going into in Vietnam. If any of you guys have seen Forrest Gump, you know, the movie has a ton of historical inaccuracies. I would not recommend it as a historical study, but they do show you kind of the landscape of Vietnam, like what the jungles are really like, the monsoon season, the challenges, you know, of trying to get through dense foliage and all the things that American soldiers really hadn't experienced very much before. So when Vietnamese soldiers are using the climate and the environment to their advantage, you know, they know the good hiding spots, they know how to camouflage themselves better. That can be really, really effective, even if your weaponry is not as advanced as someone else's. Another problem, the Viet Cong were living side by side with South Vietnamese civilians. Remember, I told you the Viet Cong were in the South. We're not talking about the NVA, the North Vietnamese Army, who would be marching around with uniforms and, you know, clearly identifiable. These are guerrillas. These are people that are hiding in plain sight. That may sound familiar to you if you remember talking about the American Revolution. You know, that was one of the complaints that the British had, that the Americans weren't really fighting fair, and that, you know, the people they thought were British subjects were actually Americans in rebellion. And so it's kind of echoing that sentiment, I think, here. And then lastly, there were mines and traps all over the countryside. Again, because we are outsiders coming into Vietnam, we don't know all the best hiding spots. And not to say that we can't learn some of this stuff, but we're at a serious disadvantage when, you know, the defense is that strong. Ultimately, one major difference in this war is the way the major players viewed it. The United States sees this war as a military struggle. This is just another objective. Like, we want to achieve our goal and move on. We want to stop communism and then we'll be happy. Whereas the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong, they see this as a battle for their existence. And again, it's kind of that, I hate to keep using the American Revolution, but I think you can see some parallels here that the people are trying to change their way of life and they want to fight for it and they will do anything to fight for it and they're not willing to compromise on their goals. And that's something that America, just kind of discounted. Like, we think about the time frame in the 1960s, mid 1960s. Nothing in the world sounds worse to an American than communism. They can't possibly understand why anybody would want to embrace communism, and they see it as the North Vietnamese are forcing communism on people that don't want it. But that's not necessarily the case. And so the South Vietnamese, were sometimes challenging. It was challenging to convince them to work with Americans. This is a graphic that actually is in your textbook if you chose to take one home with you. Sorry. This shows you just some of the tunnels, the hidden tunnels that were used by the Viet Cong. So this is an example of how, they were at an advantage, that they knew their own terrain so much better and that they knew the best places to hide. So you can see they've got a pretty nice setup here. There's a first aid station, there's a bedroom station or sleeping chamber, a conference room, gotta have conferences apparently. Snake pit that would cause somebody to fall in rather than finding the actual hiding spot. There's a well that's kind of cut off or sealed from the outside world. A kitchen, they've even got like venting for the kitchen ventilation. They've got weapons, they've got booby traps, and they've got this submerged entrance, which is really clever. And honestly, not every person would be able to swim into that. So it's a pretty good protection. Okay, to get into some of the strategies used in Vietnam, the Americans and the South Vietnamese try to wage this hearts and minds campaign. So the name itself maybe tells you, like, we're trying to win the hearts and minds. We're trying to win mentally and emotionally to get the South Vietnamese people to trust the military and to trust the United States and win over their spirit. Basically, we want to win their allegiance. We want them to feel allegiance towards the United States and towards the ARVN and ultimately towards democracy rather than the communist ideology. This is supposed to take the form of social and economic programs. So basically what we want to do is make our lifestyle, our way of life more appealing. Show them that capitalism is better, show them that democracy is better. We don't do a great job of it, and the South Vietnamese especially don't do a great job of it. So the leadership in South Vietnam, I want to say it's Yem that comes up with the idea of the agrovilles and the strategic hamlets. But basically what happens is, remember I told you the Viet Cong are living mixed within the South Vietnamese citizens. So the solution to this is, let's make the South Vietnamese citizens move so that we can tell this is a safe village or an unsafe village. And it's sold to the people as like, you'll be safe, you'll be away from the rebels and they can't harm you and therefore we won't harm you. But I mean, look at what's going on in our own country right now over the coronavirus. Like, people are not going to just easily say, sure, let's move our whole livelihood. Okay, I'm worried about the rebels. Even if your neighbor has a different ideology than you, they're still your neighbor. You still know them a little bit better than the government. Maybe you trust your neighbor a little bit more than the government. Again, I see parallels to this right now in 2020. So the Hearts and Minds campaign does not go in the direction they were hoping. Beginning in 1965, the tide of the war changes, and it is obvious that the North is beginning to win. As a result, America really steps up their strategy. The American strategy changes as the war becomes, quote unquote, ours. So really what it means is, like I mentioned, that the South Vietnamese, government was kind of collapsing in 1965. So what happens is the American military takes on a leadership role, and it's meant to be temporary, like, get your new guy in here and get this situated. The new guy is not great either. He's a military leader of the South Vietnamese. The people really don't like him, don't trust him. So ultimately, what this means is American control continues to escalate and escalate and escalate. And eventually, this war really becomes our war. General William Westmoreland, the American commander in Vietnam, begins to think of this war as a war of attrition. Basically, that means that you're going to fight to the bloody end. No matter what, you want punishment for people. You are not going to just allow people to surrender. You fight ultimately until they give up. So there's a couple of things that he does. First of all, he institutes this idea of the body count. It is a tally that is kept and shared each day to represent the number of the VC or enemy killed. He thinks that this will scare people. And again, you could use the modern news cycle as an example of this. If you see a certain number, it becomes scary to think there's a lot of people being killed. But I can't help but consider parallels to the Hunger Games. And remember, well, maybe you don't know, but the author said that she was inspired to write the book based on coverage of, I think, the Iraqi war in the 90s. But, this idea of, okay, at the end of the day, we're going to broadcast all the people that were killed, and that's going to crush everyone's spirit. And what it really does is kind of inspire them to fight harder. So this could be a strategy that sort of backfired. Additionally, there was widespread use of napalm and Agent Orange. Why would they do this? So I'm going to go ahead and show you the pictures really quick. This one here is an example of a field being covered in napalm. And this one besides my face, whoops. There we go. This one here is dropping Agent Orange. So napalm, if you're not familiar, I think it's a derivative of crude oil. I'm not super savvy on this kind of stuff, but I know that it's a jelly-like substance and it's similar to gasoline, or maybe, again, like a byproduct of gasoline. I don't know, but it's highly flammable. And so they would just drop it and, cause widespread forest fires. Basically, they're trying to clear the area so that they can see where people are hiding and to eliminate places to hide. Agent Orange is a chemical that is a defoliant. Basically, that means that it causes leaves to fall off of trees and, like scrubby little brush type things. Remember, we're in a rainforest or in jungle type territory. So the purpose of both of these things would be to eliminate places to hide. If you are familiar at all with the Vietnam War, or if you've heard about napalm or Agent Orange, you know that they have very long-lasting consequences. There are still thousands of babies being born in Vietnam to this day that are affected by Agent Orange. So it's a complicated legacy, but for now you just need to know what it actually is and what it was intended to do. The other thing is they have these search and destroy missions. And remember, they're not just for Call of Duty, they are real life. So the search part maybe is not surprising, like we're looking for the bad guy, let's find them, but destroy, as in let's destroy farms, let's destroy fields, let's destroy villages. Really, if we find out that a village is hiding someone, we're going to just burn it to the ground. We're going to not worry about the loss of life or the loss of property or the loss of livelihood. So that's something to be aware of as well. Oops, sorry. There we go. So how does all of this impact soldiers? The morale among the soldiers tends to drop as the war goes on. Why? Maybe this is obvious, but let's talk about it. First and foremost, casualties. I mean, the fear of injury, the fear of being killed, like that is psychologically exhausting. And it's going to ultimately impact your experience. And again, some of it too is like a personal level, like the leadership. If you have a really good leader, if you have a really good general or, I don't know, commanding officer that you are inspired by, then maybe your morale was higher. If you had one that you didn't trust, that you weren't inspired by, they maybe weren't as effective, then perhaps your morale was lower. Initially, it was believed that the war would end quickly, but obviously that was not the case. So, you think about, again, 1950s, early 60s, the American perspective, like we have all these bombs, we have all these weapons. Vietnam, what do you have? I mean, the thought process is like we just go in and drop everything and it's done. And that did not necessarily end up being the case, obviously. Unlike in World War II, the threat to America is indirect. So remember, in World War II, we were neutral until Pearl Harbor, until we were directly attacked. And America responds to that. In Vietnam, we don't have a direct attack. We don't have anything that's directly threatened other than an indirect threat to our way of life. And the domino theory is presented in the 1950s for the first time, the idea that, one country becomes communist and then it continues from there. But Vietnam is across the world. And I think it was hard for Americans to really be able to understand like why we should be so worried about communism in a country across the world. If it comes to Canada, maybe we should worry. If it comes to the United Kingdom, maybe we should worry. But we have different partnerships with those countries than we do with really any country in Southeast Asia, at least in the 1960s. Also, something to consider: the men that are serving rather, are required to do so by law. So the draft requires them to serve. But the type of man serving has changed since World War II. And I'm really going to get into that in the next PowerPoint that we do. Yay, another one. But mainly what you really want to understand is that these guys in Vietnam are younger, on average, tend to be younger, tend to be less educated, tend to be lower income, and tend to be more ethnically and racially diverse. So they're facing a different set of circumstances, a different set of challenges, and the way that life is changing in the 60s is very different than the way life changed in the 1940s. Got a couple of pictures here of some kind of famous Vietnam veterans. This guy here is Gerald Coffey, and he was just famous as being somebody that supported the war regardless. He was a prisoner of war for a while. He ended up writing about his experiences. You may recognize this guy here, John McCain, and this is President Nixon. This was during the Watergate scandal when Nixon was trying to buy himself some good publicity. So he's greeting these POWs that are returning from Vietnam. John McCain recently ran for president, so you probably are familiar with him. But again, he was a prisoner of war that, always supported the American military and never kind of changed his perspective. And he was injured as well, as you can see. Then this gentleman here is Ron Kovic. He also was a Vietnam veteran and a prisoner of war. You can see he's quite decorated here. He's got a lot of medals. He volunteered to go to war. He was excited to serve his country, and his experiences in Vietnam really changed his mind, and he ends up becoming a very strong anti-war kind of protester. He was arrested a bunch of different times at like veterans hospitals and universities, and I think even in Washington, D.C. a handful of times. He wrote a book called Born on the 4th of July. You may have seen the movie starring Tom Cruise, but he kind of represents this changing face, I'd say, of the American veteran. So, you've got John McCain in like 72, 73 right here, Ron Kovic around the same time. Very different experience, very different outcome, very different perspective. Just something to keep in mind. Finally, how does all of this impact Americans at home? Wrapping it up here. In many ways, historians agree that the Vietnam War killed the Great Society. Remember, the Great Society was created by LBJ as a way to improve domestic life in America. America then and now was one of the wealthiest countries in the world, but there's quite a gap between the wealthiest people in America and the poorest people in America. So President Johnson was trying to narrow the gap, close the gap a little bit. Basically, what ends up happening with Vietnam, life is a balancing act, budgets have to be balanced, and the decision has to be made between military spending and domestic spending. So in other words, increased military or guns, quote unquote guns spending meant that there would be inevitably less to spend on butter or domestic spending. It's an economic problem. I think I mentioned it in class, but if I didn't, it's kind of a classic economic problem, guns or butter decision making. And again, parallels to now, 2020 coronavirus, the American government having to reevaluate, like, where do we put our money? How do we change the budget when these situations arise? Vietnam becomes the first quote unquote living room war. So basically what that means is that people are getting like real time coverage on the nightly news in their living rooms. They know what's going on the front, or they think they know what's going on at least on the front. Conflicting information from the government is going to lead Americans to believe that there is a credibility gap. So the nightly news is painting this picture that, the war doesn't seem to be going well. And look at all these men that are injured. We have the body count every day or every week of the Viet Cong, but we also have the body count of American soldiers. And it's looking like those numbers aren't going so well for America. So why then does our president, our Secretary of Defense, our general in Vietnam continue to tell America we are winning the war if it doesn't seem that we are? And that's really what creates this credibility gap. Okay, made it to the end. I hope that my sound actually recorded this entire thing. And I hope that you guys are going to have an amazing weekend. No, you won't have an amazing weekend because you're going to see this on Monday. Next weekend will be amazing. And I hope the coronavirus ends soon so we can get back to school. And I hope to see you soon. Bye.